Years passed, and he slowly took enough native shells to number 40. These would form his spearhead of information gathering, as limited as it was at present. He needed to capture more useful creatures, as these farmers, peasants, and dying miscreants, as unseen as they were by the societies they infiltrated, were ultimately nothing more than silent zombies, unthinking, and merely gathering minor facts about the immediate area. He needed one of the followers of a host, what they called a priest. Yes, one of these would be perfect, as then he could gain vast information on their very gods. And so he sought a priest out, a lowly one that might be missed. He travelled himself in created shell, and in quick time he found one. He was dressed in black, and hid himself from others around him, much like those he had already taken. And so, in a darkened alley, he approached this creature. As he neared, it turned to him, and he saw it as one of those known to the Prime as a human. He had seen them seeded throughout the primes he had spied upon thus far, and seemed to be one of the most proliferate of races around, spreading their numbers much like him, although slower, across their realms.
"Greetings! Could I be of assistance to you, sir?"
it said, addressing him as he approached.
"Do you seek aid?"
Too easy, he thought, as he drew closer to him. "Yes, I seek information on your god." A smile crept across his face.
"Oh, you wish to meet him?"
it said, as though it was a simple matter. "Why, yes," he said, and stood in front of his quarry, waiting for what he needed to do, ready to follow his new-found friend.
"He is this way,"
it said, motioning him down the crooked alley. He smiled and nodded. "Thank you, friend," beginning to walk the path as directed. "This was too easy, and soon I shall find—" And with that, his body shot through with pain. Looking down, he could see a sliver of metal protruding from his chest.
"You shall see him soon enough,"
the voice said, shrieking with glee as its possessor drew the blade from him and plunged it again and again into his back. The pain was great, but strangely comforting. He could not feel within his host, but in this body he could actually experience such sensations. The point of the piercing of the skin, the puncturing of the flesh, and the pain of his sinew and organs being sliced, and it was a joyful thing to him. He turned to his assailant, smiling, and mouthed the words, "Thank you," as he realized his shell could no longer stand, as blood gushed from the wounds, and the body crumpled slowly. It stood over him, still smiling, but shocked at his reaction.
You felt nothing?"
And it nudged him gently with his foot. He tried to respond, but found he could not speak, and as he tried, he just spat out the blood that was filling his lungs and mouth. "These meat things are very frail," he noted, as he lay there in the dying shell. But he realized that, although life was slipping from this shell, he was still able to observe the world around him, and he watched on as it turned him over and searched his body for something useful. It seemed happy when he discovered coins upon him, and he took them for its own, leaving his body to ebb away in a dark corner. He waited, and hours later, vermin arrived, a few at first, fighting amongst themselves for fresh pickings of this feast. Soon more came, and soon he could barely see the world, for their numbers were vast, like the creations of the demonic hordes, and then shortly he could see nothing, for his eyes were torn out and devoured. So he found he had to resort to seeing through the threads that were rapidly fading from his body. But what was this? These creatures, although not of a magical nature themselves, actually carried magic. Of course, the ambient levels of this place meant there was a possibility that all creatures were held with at least some magical power, as it permeated them throughout their lives, flowing through the realms unseen to the lower forms of life. He reached out to one of them, and found it was easy to control. So, although he could not duplicate them, as he was not with his host, he could jump bodies and see the world through the eyes of the lesser creatures. Or perhaps head back and gain a more useful body. He would see more first. These creatures, rats as he understood them, ran through the city, heading from meal to meal, from corpse to dropped snack, and opportune kills, with the rest of the pack. Host? Pack? Swarm? He would have to learn the correct terms for these things at some point, but for now, he needed to ride the body back to the host. He discovered that his threads were actually too much power for this creature, and slowly it began to falter and decay, as the sheer power of the elevated magic within it was far too high for its body to hold, and it started to break down and disintegrate. Quickly he shifted his power to another of the pack, and started to herd it back to the host portal. He now knew that the lesser creatures could be used to escape capture, ride forms with, and spy where the larger sentient ones could not approach. This could come in useful, he was sure, if he could find a way to utilize it, as it appeared the denizens of the realms either ignored them or tolerated their presence, as the numbers were insurmountable, and the fact of being was an accepted one. As he reached the host and placed his threads back within it, he felt the many become one once more, as all the threads he held within knitted together again and absorbed the knowledge. Now all threads knew what this thread had known, and this is how he must continue. Scout, run, report, over and over, until he was ready. But first, he had a score to settle. Once ready, and with the passage of a few days, he sought out his quarry, in the dark alley where he had been slain prior, and sure enough, it was there once more, and he approached it slowly. "Hello, friend." It looked up, slowly, the colour draining from its face as it saw the one it killed but a few nights prior stood there before him once again. He could feel the fear rising in it, and smiled broadly as it tried to run. He leapt forward and grabbed its wrist. "You said you would show me your god." It shook with fear as it clawed at his hand, trying to release the grip, but soon discovered that it was futile, and sagged visibly with resignation. "Help!" it shouted suddenly, as though it had realized a strategy that would save it from this madman. "Help! Mugger!" He threw his body into the one who had slain him, and crushed the wind out of his lungs as it slammed into the wall. "You owe me a god," he said, still smiling. It tried to speak, but found a hand clamped across its face tightly, cutting its voice from the night air, and it then became aware of the voice. It began in its head and seemed to echo around the alley. Run. Seek help. It froze for a second, and then elation hit. "He has heard my calls!" And it found a renewed vigor. The man who held him tight began to relax his grip, and it tried to shove him away. As the grasp on the wrist slipped, it felt the arm go limp, and the body was pushed easily away, allowing it to knock him to the ground. "You aren't getting up this time," it said, pulling a pair of knives from its boot and setting to work on his chest, neck, and face. All that was left was more food for the rats. He looked from his new vantage point, slightly taller than he was used to, and spoke again. "Good work. Now quickly, before he rises again." It nodded to the night and ran into the darkness, through several tunnels and holes, doors, several windows, eventually resting outside a large, heavy-set door, with strange markings upon it. As it gathered its breath, it gasped, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the strength to fight that thing off." It was nothing. "Now take me home." And it nodded, rapping upon the door of the huge building crafted from a strange black stone. The door opened slowly, and a guard stood in metal and leather, and nodded, allowing it in. It walked through a few corridors, stopped at an imposing robed figure who gestured to a small chamber, and left it there. Within the room lay several small stools, a table, a few stiff-looking cushions, and a small altar of offering. This was it, he thought, looking intently at the altar. Finally, I can see what it is they do. And he waited. It knelt in front of the altar, lowering its head, slowing its breathing, and clearing its thoughts. As it was calmed and ready, several minutes had passed, and the faint smell of insects began to drift into the air, seemingly from the altar itself.
"Tonight I met a man who I slew the night last," it began,
speaking slowly to the altar.
"and I did as you asked, and made sure he did not return again."
And with that he bowed his head to the floor and waited. You were told to kill me. He thought, pondering what truths this place would hold, and waited. Nothing. No power, no threads, no contact, just nothing.
"Of course I will continue to do your bidding,"
it said, and rifled around its pockets, dropping the coins it had taken from his body the nights before into a box at the side of the altar.
"I will bring you more next time to receive your blessings again. Thank you for your aid and words this night."
He had spoken to this creature, no one else. There was nothing contacting this creature but him, and now he was with him. He would sense if anything was touching his soul or his body, but no. He sensed nothing. Something is amiss here, he mused, and waited. It stood up after a few minutes, and seemed to be waiting for something. The large robed figure that had motioned it into this room earlier entered, and picked up the box, shaking it slightly. A nod was given, and a sense of relief was felt from the figure as it left the chamber. Wait, was this it? Those coins were all they were bothered about. But he had said he had heard... Oh. It looked into a bowl of water on the table, and as it did, it saw not what he had seen, but something else. It saw an image that it did not, an image of a stronger creature, a more confident creature. It thought it was something it was not, and all because of its belief in this altar, or whatever it was representing. It made no sense, but then it dawned on him. I spoke to it, and it thought I was the one it served. And he smiled. It did not know. It could not distinguish between me and a voice that, by the look of it, it had never known. They were manipulated this easily. Well, this could even be fun. Well done, he said to it, and it blinked the water from its eyes as it washed its face.
"You are still with me?"
it asked, slowly, shocked by getting another voice. Oh yes, I am with you until your end. Oh, how much fun this could be. The power to make it do as he wanted, and all because it thought he was a greater power. Not that he was not, but that it thought he was whatever this thing he followed was. Tell me my name, believer, the voice said in its head, and it nodded to the altar and stood straight as though being observed by a superior.
"Your name is Arnosh, god of the dark paths, of the night."
He sought this knowledge, and knew nothing of such a host, although more could have been spread than he knew of course, and there were more primes than he had seen too. Perhaps this was a true host. He would need to find this one, and take it. Come, I will guide you to a truth of the night, but you must hurry, for if light breaks the day, you will never find it. He laughed inwardly as it jumped, looking around frantically.
Where do you need me to go?"
it shouted, spinning around, shouting to the ceiling, and then the altar. It felt the voice seemingly smile from within him, and it felt it had been touched by the very gods themselves. He led it through the streets, back where it had passed that night, as it was the only route he knew, and past the scene of his would-be demise earlier and previously. The rats had been here already, Eventually, an out-of-breath human happened upon a ramshackle hut, beneath which lay a long-forgotten cave system, and within this system lay a portal to the last place it would ever know. Exhausted, it collapsed just outside the hut, watching the night slowly slipping from above, and the first rays of light threatening to breach the slowly lightening sky. On your feet and quickly now, before the light touches you.
Of course, sorry,
it said, as it slowly dragged its panting body into the hut, and then through the tunnels, guided by an unnatural vision that it did not possess itself, as though being granted a sight beyond mere mortals. It was, just not from where it thought it was from. He had enjoyed watching this creature do his bidding, run across the city on his command, without question, and he had felt the joy, the euphoria, and the elation as it had been touched by a voice that was, to the best of its knowledge, that of its own god. Perhaps this is why they follow, and why the host allowed them to do so. And he recalled something he had been told by the great scaled ones. They follow blindly in some cases, but in almost all they follow because they see something in that deity that they wish to aspire to hold on to become one with. For some it is for betterment, and for others it is for penance, but it serves both supplicant and God. You see, the power of the gods' gift unto their followers, their believers, their armies, is also returned to them in greater portion by their supplicants' belief in them. In short, the gods give power and receive power back, and it is always the gods that gain in this pact. So this creature believed he was something it was not, and what it saw in the water was what it was aspiring to, what it believed this god was giving it. Its own mind created a belief in something that he could find no trace of. Was it even there? He would soon find out when he met in person. He led it to the portal, where it fell on its knees, and it asked,
"Is this where I'm supposed to be? A demonic portal to the plains of despair?"
it asked, fearing the answer that would come. "Yes, I brought you here, to your truth." And with that he left it, and entered the host body, entwining with his other threads, letting them know what he knew, and then crafted a new body again, in front of this creature, and entered it once more. At the creation of that which it had now killed twice, it began to shake, its mind unable to comprehend what it was seeing, as out of nowhere the form of that which it had been slain returned, slowly as though a ghost at first, but quickly spun full form. Its mouth hung open, eyes agog, and what sanity it had been holding on to at this point, left for a time. "Now see me, at least see one of my forms," he said, his voice booming through the tunnels, and it fell to its knees, shaking as it looked up at him.
You are not him!"
It managed to get out the words before words were lost to its mind, as the form created finally became whole, solid, and real. "No, indeed I am not your god, but I could be," he said, slowly, letting it sink into its head. He reached out and touched it with his threads, and felt the mind racing, the thoughts unable to craft properly. It could not comprehend what it was seeing, what it had witnessed, done, and now beheld at the end of its journey. "Perhaps I've driven this one too far," he reasoned, and lifted his hand to point toward it, and as he was about to release threads to begin conversion of this one to his own, it spoke.
"Show me,"
it said, slowly, shaking the words out among its drooling gape, and it looked up in despair, waiting for the words of this unknown entity before it. He recalled again what the scaled ones had said about followers of faith, and the gods needing them in order to gain power above. To actually be a host, it was a necessity. Perhaps this will be a good opportunity, he thought, and responded with, "Yes, I will take you as my first supplicant upon this realm. I will gift you power, unlike your old god, and all you need do is bring me a priest of those who you worshipped before, one of those known to worship Arnosh. It nodded uncontrollably, shaking, and clearly was having problems with his form. He looked at its eyes, and then he realized he had not removed the vision he had gifted it. No wonder, it's driving him to insanity. And he touched it on the brow and removed this gifted sight. Immediately it looked calmer, as the visions abated. No more could it see the threads, the souls and the essences twisting within them, screaming for aid and clawing to escape the impenetrable power that held them within. It no longer saw a vision of total despair, and the penetrating web of threads that intertwined the tunnels and the very portal in front of him, which now looked dark, like a vertical inky water, smooth as glass. "Here," he said, passing a coin to it and pushing magic into it. "It will allow you to see in the darkest places. Consider it your first gift from your new god. And remember, give me what I ask for, and you will be rewarded for your duty." And he fixed his gaze upon it unnervingly. It drew itself to its feet and looked at him, accepting the coin.
Yes, I will."
"I only ask of you one thing, and one thing only. A portion of what you call your life, and I will use it to give you immortality within me. And for this I will gift, in the hole it will leave, I will gift you with my own power, as a god will do."
Yes, of course,"
it said, and moved forward, an arm outstretched. "Easier than I thought." He smiled and grasped it by the head, and drew all but a small part of its soul from its body, leaving enough behind for it to function and live, but so that he had all he needed from it should it die. It screamed till it lost its voice, and fell to the ground unconscious. He waited, and as he did he lived through the old memories of this creature. It was a he, a male, a human, and he was one of 4 other brothers. His mother killed by his father, and he was the only survivor of his father's wrath for some reason he did not know. He had killed his father, then sought penance with the priesthood, but from all accounts this group of followers had never shown a propensity for magics of any kind. In fact, they seemed to be utterly without power at all. They were mere mortals, and showed no sign of the touch of the divine upon them. It had been taken in by a con artist, a charlatan, and although it half knew it, it wanted to belong, to be part of something that had a cause it could throw itself at in an attempt to earn forgiveness for its actions. He understood now. This one was a lost soul too, and it had been lied to. It followed no god, unless these coins were believed to be of a god somehow, so it could not show him its god, nor bring a priest of that cult to his grasp. But maybe he could use this, and take this small cult for his own in time. Perhaps it could be the first true priest within that lie that had caught it. Yes, he would give it the means to exact its revenge, and in doing so cement his tie to this one, and in time use it to attempt to rise back to the hosts, by means of the path the scaled ones had spoken of, through the rites of the ancients, and the path of the scions. It finally woke to find itself on a small patch of grass just outside its city, and remembered vividly what had transpired. For a few minutes it sat, making sense of it all, and for a brief moment thought it had merely drank too much, or taken something that disagreed with its mind. At least until, as it stood up, it felt the coin in its pocket, and as he grasped it, he could see a soft glow emanating from the world around. It was real, he thought, and reeled from the reality of it all, and began to slowly make its way to the city. It headed to the temple, where it had been the night prior, but discovered on the way that it had been gone a lot longer than a single day, 4 days in fact. As it entered through the large black doors, it was met by the robed figure again, and roughly taken by the arm and led into a back room. Hours passed by, and it emerged from the temple beaten, part broken, its face bruised, lash marks on its back and arms. It was angry, and headed to find its friends. It told them of what it had encountered, and the events of the past days, of the one it killed that then reappeared again, testing its will, and it killed it again, and that the god they knew as Arnosh was a false god, a falsity spun by a thieves' guild, and nothing more. By the time the night fell, it had 9 with it, heading to the temple. Each had been a part of his lie. Each wanted answers, payback, and worse from the so-called Temple of Arnosh. Upon arrival, vengeance was swift and decisive. No survivors, and none escaped. The Temple of Arnosh was stripped of all they could use, and all but 2 left with their gains. It turned to them and asked if they would be the second and third of the following of this new god, and they agreed to the request, and so he had started a following. It returned to the tunnels alone and reported what had transpired, and he appeared again as the one it had slain. I cannot travel to them. They must come here, for my form will be sensed by others who would cause me harm as I begin my faith anew. It nodded and accepted this half-truth, and left to bring the new disciples back. The real truths were many, but the main one that was he could not walk upon the plain, and strip the soul from a creature without causing a scene, or risking a demonic feeding frenzy, whereas here, where the veil was thin and the threads were close to his host, he could exercise complete control and do what was needed to be done. Within hours, the one was then 3, and he now had a power base on which to slowly spread. He, however, demanded that he would keep the name Arnosh, as he would give them what the false idol had not. So they kept the temple, and began anew, each with a coin in hand of strange hue. For years to come their numbers grew, and he kept gaining more souls, and hence more of an understanding, as well as control over those he gained. Any that tried to leave would find themselves visited by strange entities of darkness in the depths of night, which would whisper their darkest secrets, and force them to seek Arnosh to quell their voices. This control was simple, and so he left one of the greater threats to carry this on, as he focused his attentions elsewhere. Arnosh grew for many years upon this prime, but naturally drew the attention of followers of hosts, those of divinity, whereupon they investigated this temple of Arnosh, questioning and probing, trying to discover the truth behind them. They were invited in, and told of the events that transpired, of the deceit and the aid given by their new named saviour Arnosh. They were amazed to find a possibly unknown new divinity here that they had no knowledge of, and were eager to learn more. And so the invitation was given to one of their high priests, one known as Kotel, and he accepted eagerly to be the first to catalogue this new divinity, this hidden god. He was led to the tunnels, whereupon he would be told the great truth that had been revealed to them. By this point, the first followers of Arnosh had gained a decade, and gained many allies, and a somewhat small fortune. He had used a good portion of it to erect a watchtower and a fortified gateway to the tunnels, where the old hovel had once stood, and had stationed a mercenary group who were also true followers of Arnosh. The high priest was amazed and intrigued, and of course was more than willing to see this truth, and learn more for his own faith's records. The portal was still there, as it had been since it was first seen, inky and black, like sheer glass, and the high priest stood across the cave from it, peering in its direction. He focused his power and let out a yelp of fear. "It is a portal to the demonic realms, you fools!" he hissed, turning to the first one, who smiled at him knowingly.
"Yes, it is. And this god listens to us, and helps us."
And he pushed Kotel towards the portal.
"And most importantly, needed to speak with you. I have one for you, Arnosh!"
he cried out, and the portal rippled, sending droplets of blackness spattering around the cave, and out stepped that first form that had tormented it so many years ago. "Thank you. You will be rewarded well," he said, and turned his attention to the high priest. "And now to find some truths." And with that he grasped Kotel by the throat, and lifted him several feet into the air, growing in height and stature as he did, and the first and second watched on as he started to take the truth from him, thread by bloody thread. They closed their hands around their coins and watched on in awe, wonder and terror as they saw the blood flow, the skin tear and flay, and the limited sight they had showed the threads of magic drawn out and be shredded by their god. They were witnessing a pivotal moment in history, but they did not know it, and never would. He talked with the high priest as he slowly stripped the power from him, step by step, piece by piece, savouring the divine power he had been imbued with. Kotel pleaded with him at first, then tried to fight him with his given power, but this daemon was just too much for him, despite his ranking, and he began to realize the futility of his position. "Yes, you are mine now, and I will learn all you know, as I consume your soul, mortal," he stated, as a matter of fact, as he revelled in the first of a host's power to be given him in many centuries. But he must not kill him, for he might need him. He needed a high priest in order to enact the rites of the Scion, or the Ascension rites, or, to be truthful with himself, he needed another who knew exactly what to do, who had perhaps performed such in the past, to guide his hand in this matter. He needed this priest's soul, but needed a high priest. But maybe he could do so with this Kotel under his wing. "No, monster, I will not do your bidding," Kotel screamed in his mind, for he could talk no more, as the magic being stripped from him tore away his throat, and had already been pulling out his ability to control his body. He smiled to him and assured him, his voice echoing through his mind, "No, Kotel, you will not be doing my bidding." And he waved a hand to motion threads to begin creating another form. "But your new form will do it for me." He held Kotel in front of his newly forming duplicate, so he could see, and then he pushed his demonic sight into the remnants of the priest, so he could witness the true horror of this creation, of twisted souls and demons of raw essence, and there he saw something familiar as his life finally ebbed and his consciousness was lost. His own soul. Kotel was no more, as every last part of him, magical, physical and divine, was taken into this form. A small portion of Kotel was used, transferred from the original, that of Kotel's own soul, as without this he would not be able to commune with his host, nor use his powers. He commanded the new priest to show his power, and he tried, but announced he had none left. Of course he didn't, for he had used it trying to fight him off. He poured power into the priest, and asked again, and he gifted himself sight, as he had witnessed before. "Good," he said, and nodded to the first and second. "Take him back to the priesthood, and thank them for his truths, for he will be their undoing." And with that the three left the cave and headed back toward the city. Yes, he will indeed be their undoing, he thought, looking back toward them as they left the cave. And I shall take what this one known as Karnefos has in time. As the years passed on, the shade of Kotel infiltrated the Karnef temples effortlessly. They could not detect the change, it seemed, as they had not encountered his kind before, and therefore had no knowledge or way to detect or even be aware of such. This agent within this faith gathered a lot of important knowledge about the gods of the realm, and also about the rites, rituals, sacred places, and locations of power, and so much more. In time there came a holy day, whereupon one of the grand high priests of this priesthood came from across the realms to visit the area, and this is when he learnt of the rites he needed, as this priest became his, as Kotel had long ago. The knowledge now secured, all he needed was more agents, and so the Karnef priesthood was slowly drawn to him, one by one, and replaced by his shades, each with a sliver of their soul, so as not to arouse suspicion. This priesthood were the wardens of the dead. They were responsible for the dead of the realms, or more precisely, for the keeping of the dead, and ensuring they were not pulled back from the beyond once their times had come and the rites had been read. They were combatants of the undead, but that aside were peaceful in both war and peace times. At least as long as no one was resurrecting the dead without good reason or against their will. They were, it seemed, by all accounts, bankers of the bodies of the fallen, ensuring that once debts had been paid, they could sleep easy in their eternal rest. Of course, this was only offered to those of their number, or those who sought them out, usually for fear of something after their death, or even due to trying to keep secrets from would-be necromancers and dabblers of the dark arts. For once dead, the will to resist was little at best, but Karnef made their will indomitable. These little priests were perfect, for he could listen to all, and through their powers, which he could use through them, he could also question the dead should he need to, something he had never thought of till now. He was finally getting a foothold. Time passed, and opportunities arose. He encountered other priesthoods and other faith followers, of Ursuline and Kalanave, and also one or two others who had lost their link to the gods in times past, but kept their faith alive in the form of cults, awaiting the return of their gods one day. And then he encountered a problem. As he tried to infiltrate Ursuline, he discovered they had close ties to another, who Karnef also knew well, but rarely acted with directly, those of Riona. Their high priest sensed something was amiss when they first met with Kotel, and even when the Grand High Priest was sent to assure her something was not amiss, she was seemingly too smart. Riona, however, was known as the Goddess of Peace, so her followers would never move against the other churches for fear of causing conflict, or so he thought. Their priestess contacted strange folk, who he would learn were those of the wild, the actual raw primal power of life upon the prime itself. He learned quickly that their priests, known as druids, were able to sense unnatural things, or rather, things that were not native to their realm, their prime, and this was a problem. Druids were brought into the city, and they began to watch the Karnef priests, and in short time they had identified many of his shades, and had begun to follow them. It would have been easier to avoid these druidic nuisances, but in the end he would have to confront them, and so he sent a small envoy, including Kotel, to their nearest circle several days outside of the city. Upon arrival they found a host of people and creatures waiting for them. Those of Karnef who were not shades were motioned forth and greeted, while others of the gathering stepped forth and approached the shades. They looked them over and asked that they all follow them to their meeting place, within their sacred area. Of course, the Karnef priests followed, shades and all. Upon entering the sacred ground, the shades suddenly became fearful, skittish, unsure of themselves, as the link to his power was severed. One of the druids stepped forward and took Kotel's hands and stared into his eyes, unblinking.
"Something is within these ones,"
he announced, and those acting oddly were grouped together, while the rest of Karnef's priests watched on.
"Yes, something unnatural resides within, and they are not complete. Bring them to the circle."
They were led to the standing stones and herded easily into the centre, their wills weakened and their minds clearly confused. Chanting was heard, and shortly after the divination was concluded.
"I do not know what has transpired within your temples, but these," he said, pointing to the shades, "are not your people. Well, not truly your people."
The rest of the Karnef representatives looked on and clearly did not understand what the druid was stating.
"To put it simply, your priests are dead. These are impostors."
At this point, the shades seemed to gain control of their bodies again, and began shouting at the druid, demanding proof, and denying his divination results. At this point, the druids began to encircle them, and drew forth weapons of wood and bone. The priest's eyes glazed over, and the demonic part came to the forefront, and took over their actions. They leapt forward with speed, attacking the druids with claws they had not had before, as the demonic's eyes showed through, warping the flesh of their hosts into vicious edges, and hardening their skin to protect their forms. The druids fought back quickly, sending lightning at them, shocking them, searing flesh from them, splitting the unnatural essence with each strike, and capturing it inside fetishes of dedicated bone as they struck home upon them. The confrontation was swift, and final. And although they were slain, so were several druids. The Karneth priests were told quite simply that
"You may not take these bodies, as they are not of this world,"
and asked to leave and spread this word to the priesthood. They left hurriedly, with thanks and concern, as well as loss and anger. It would be the start of the distrust of the druidic ways by those who followed Karneth, as they did not fully understand what had transpired. The druids who were slain were committed to the earth, and offerings and ceremonies were performed, and their head druid, who had led the assault and the divination, led them and told them how to see the falsities. And so it came to pass the knowledge that only those who followed the wild could sense and see the shades became known to the druids, and in time Riona would also be shown and told this. For the druids had warriors of their own, and were distrustful of most of the gods of the realms, and chose not to share this information. One thing was sure, and that was that no druid could ever be taken and made such a shade of, and then allowed to gain entrance to their sacred places. They were, effectively, not able to be taken by such subterfuge as the other priestheads would in time. He sensed that he had lost connection to those who were being slain at the point they entered some place of power in the wilderness. In time, he learned about the druids, and about their ways, and that they could sense his presence. They would be problematic in time, and all he could do was deal with them when the time came. He created those he had lost anew, and sent them far from where they had last been, to spread the word of Karneth elsewhere, to bolster other temples around the lands. At least their forms were still useful to him. The host known as the Wild of this prime now knew of an entity that was not of the prime, stealing the soul and life of others, and making their own twisted demonic forms of such. It reasoned that it was a demonic incursion, and took steps to warn other hosts of this. However, a host that is in place upon a world is not party to information another host gifts them to from on high, so he needed to force a way for the other hosts whose presence was focused upon this world to become aware of the problem before it became too much for them to combat. And so it closed itself off to the world for a time, while it tried to find an answer. The druid's influence upon the realm dwindled for a time, and the numbers stagnated. Eventually the answer was divined, and came in a form that his daemon would eventually use to get its own wishes heard. An ascension was needed. A rise to the host would allow all to hear the pleas, and react accordingly within their paths. Yes, this would work, it had to work, or else the prime would fall to the ravages of a daemon kind of nature hitherto unknown. And so both sides began their plans to force an ascension, but neither side knew the intent of the other, and so continually worked against them where they were discovered. Perhaps had the Wild been privy to the fact of the demon's origins, or more precisely, the fact that it was in fact a host itself, things would have gone much faster, and with far less bloodshed, at least for their own kind. And so, as the time drew upon all, a great surge was felt around the primes, as a new god seemed to arrive, going by many differing names. But that would not matter, for Ashan was the first it chose to take under its new identity as a god, so he would continue as though all knew it as such, for the sake of ease of understanding. From the time of Ashan being established with Kotel and others firmly under the power's control, it took almost a millennia to craft and realize his machinations, and to finally have enough power and hidden forces to push forth and force an ascension. As he engineered the downfall of many high priests and the subsequent collapse of their faiths in regions across the prime, he waited and coerced others into aiding in their demise. This was working, and working well indeed. He became aware, however, of demonic planes working their way toward the prime, eager to feast with such tender targets, although some, he suspected, were there to bear witness and understand this great plan further. Some of these unfortunate denizens soon became one with him, and he learned through several of their minions and the eventual absorption of one of their overlords that there was some form of leadership amongst the grouping, and that some had banded together in an uneasy truce, but to what end he could not discover. It did not, however, stop him trying, by destroying all that would not answer his thirst for knowledge. The demonic group had become allies through necessities, as their own planes had been destroyed, but they had been able to escape from the grip of this entity that consumed all. They observed through allies their demise and the twisted shades he created, and understood they could not fight this war and win, and to this end had only one hope for survival: to enter a prime together and try and salvage their power and identities alongside the mortals of that realm. Their dethroned demonic husks would become brittle and fall to the void as they blended their threads with that of the prime, and they would become something new, something unique among their kind, at least as far as they knew. They would no longer be overlords of their own planes, crafted from their own essences and sheer power, but instead become daemons of the prime. They managed to break through the planes that surrounded one realm, one single prime, and discovered that their nature was unknown to this place. This place had a shard of the wild here, and they could sense it, but although it was extremely powerful, it seemed to be encircled and held within an area they would come to know as Lassashar. They travelled for many months on the winds and currents of magic, and eventually settled on a place for their new beginnings. It was a seemingly empty place. Nothing more than plants and small animals could be seen at first glance. But as it turned out, it was full of creatures far more deadly than he had witnessed on other primes. This place they named as Dominia, and it would be their new place of power, their own unified domain upon the prime. And so they enacted rites and rituals and bound their essences to this place, this land, and in doing so severed their tethers to the planar energies they had survived on for untold aeons. They attuned to the realm's own magical energies and began to leech what they needed from it, discovering that magic upon the primes was not as it was upon the planes. Here it was structured and followed rules set out by the ebb and flow between the elemental planes as well as the void itself, it seemed. They discovered that links could be made to the elemental planes easily, for them at least, and that they could pull magic from these places too, allowing for a vast magical store to be built up within their forms. But as they soon discovered, it was not as simple as it had been upon their own planes. On their planes, their realms, all of it was them. No matter if it were rock, a hill, a minion, or their own lashing energies, it was all essentially one essence, one mind of one purpose. Here, it was not the same. They had to create a form that was solid and reflected this realm. They needed to craft bodies that would endure aging as well as the ravages of the environment, but also they needed to find materials to create such, as they could not create a lasting material themselves, for the magic slowly seeped away or overloaded the object, causing it to become one with the magic flowing around the realm. They reached out into the world and travelled to discover possible answers to their plight, and found life that pulled minute threads from the closest demonic planes. In comparison, it was like a tap from a well was to a raging ocean's waves crashing upon a shore. But still, they were indeed using such magic. They discovered what would be known as demonologists, and they marvelled at the ability to craft, manipulate and imbue themselves with demonic energies, and began studying them. In time, their presence was sensed by the greater of their number, and they were approached with the offer of a pact. Now they knew all about pacts, and how they were often used to gain the soul of the unwitting, in exchange for an infinitesimally small portion of power to sate their mortal hunger. But they had demands of their own first. It was not long before information was gleaned, and small pacts were entered into, and they learned of the materials of the realm, and what was used by who, and for what purpose. They discovered that some materials were deemed to be gifts from the host themselves, and they were sought after by corresponding followers of such gods. Perhaps these materials would suit their purpose. They sought samples of as many as they could, but discovered that very little existed upon this place, outside of where the wild lay, and so they began using their knowledge to instead begin infusing their own realm, Dominia, with their own magic, and then crafting new bodies from these materials. The first created was only a partial success, as they missed essential rituals and rushed the process as their power slowly waned. However, the second attempt was perfect, and so the first of their number was placed within it, but still it was found to be losing power. This option would prolong their existence upon this prime, but it was not a permanent solution. It was then they were introduced to one known as Zorma. This hulking creature, they called an ogre, was adept at the manipulation of demonic energies, and surprised them with his prowess and mastery, such as it was, with the smallest of their threads. He said he knew of a way, but it would mean giving up their very nature to the prime in order to accomplish this, and they agreed. Zorma told them of the process and what was needed, and they obtained everything. The hardest part was gaining a sliver of a host, what Zorma called a spark of the true lights. However, as it turned out, these lights, although uncommon if not rare upon many primes, were plentiful upon this one, and so they captured a priest with a spark of pure divinity, or rather told them of their plight, and they agreed to aid them for insight into their old planes. And so the first recorded essence crystal was to be crafted, and it was a huge undertaking.